Would you eat a fruit that tastes like raw meat? Legends of Arabia say there is a garden that locals avoid for miles. The date palms there grow unnaturally fast, and their fruit possesses a terrifying crimson hue. The reason for this phenomenon will make your blood run cold. The roots of these trees do not drink water. They reach down into the largest mass grave of antiquity, feeding on the flesh of 40,000 people who were locked in this paradise and turned into fertilizer in a single day. Welcome to the Garden of Death. In the heart of the scorched wastelands of the Nejd, where the sun hangs in the sky like a copper shield hammered by a vengeful blacksmith, existence is usually defined by thirst and the relentless, blinding white of the dunes. Here, death is not a tragedy but a constant, silent companion that walks beside every traveler, waiting for a single stumble. Yet, rising from this geological hellscape like a hallucination born of heatstroke, stood a wall monolithic spine of clay and stone, smooth and impenetrable, defying the jagged logic of the wilderness. Behind this colossal barrier, the laws of nature had been suspended and rewritten by the will of a single man. This was the Hadikat ar-Rahman, the Garden of the Merciful, an artificial paradise constructed by Musaylama, a man who possessed the audacity to look into the face of history and declare himself a prophet equal to the messenger of God. To the Bedouins who stumbled upon this fortress, dragging their dehydrated bodies through the dust, the sounds emanating from within were more intoxicating than the strongest wine, the impossible, rhythmic splashing of abundant water and the rustling of leaves too green to belong to this burning world. Stepping through the heavy, iron-reinforced gates was an assault on the senses that bordered on nausea. The air inside was heavy, thick with moisture and the cloying, over-sweet scent of jasmine and musk that coated the back of the throat like syrup. It was a smell that masked the underlying odor of unwashed bodies and fermenting waste, a perfume sprayed over a rotting corpse to hide the truth of decay. Canals of cool water, diverted with maniacal engineering, snaked through groves of date palms whose fruit hung in clusters so heavy and swollen they looked unnatural, like chummas of sugar. Underneath these boughs, thousands of men and women wandered with the slack-jawed, glassy-eyed expressions of cattle being led to the slaughter, yet they believed themselves to be the chosen residents of eternity. They were drunk, not just on the wine that flowed here in rivers forbidden by the strict laws of the desert but encouraged by their new master, but intoxicated by the promise of salvation without sacrifice. In the center of this delirium sat Musaylama, draped in silks that shimmered with an obscene opulence against the backdrop of the rough desert. He was a master of theater, a charlatan who understood that desperate people do not need truth, they need spectacle. He performed parlor tricks with the gravity of divine intervention, forcing a chicken egg into a narrow-necked bottle through physics and vinegar, presenting it as a miracle to illiterate herdsmen who wept at the sight. He absolved them of the burden of prayer, stripped away the discipline of fasting, and told them that their base desires were holy. He spoke with a voice like honey poured over gravel, weaving a tapestry of lies so dense that it blocked out the sun. To his followers, he was the gateway to the divine, the man who had domesticated paradise and built a wall around it to keep the harsh realities of judgment and death at bay. They looked at the high fortifications not as a cage, but as a womb, unaware that they had voluntarily walked into a slaughterhouse where they were being fattened for the blade of history. The air vibrated with their laughter and the chime of gold goblets, a cacophony of joy that sounded terrifyingly hollow against the silent, brooding backdrop of the encroaching desert that waited patiently outside, knowing that all water eventually evaporates and all walls eventually fall. The fanaticism that pulsed through the veins of the people of Yamamah was not a fragile thing forged in the kilns of terror, but rather a tempered blade of supreme arrogance and an intoxicating belief in their own divine exemption. Musaylima, the master architect of their damnation, had not chained them with iron fetters, he had bound them with the far stronger ropes of absolute license, dismantling the rigid structures of prayer and fasting that governed the harsh lives of the desert tribes and replacing them with a theology of pleasure. He whispered to them that the earth was theirs to consume, that the strict moral codes of the north were shackles for the weak, and they drank his words like men dying of thirst, unaware that they were swallowing salt water that would only hasten their demise. Within the high, sun-baked walls of the garden, the concept of time began to dissolve into a hazy, indistinguishable blur of days and nights, a perpetual twilight of feasting where the rising sun brought not the call to prayer, but the uncorking of fresh wine skins. 40,000 souls were packed into this enclosure, a teeming mass of humanity that had abandoned the rhythms of the natural world for a frantic, hysterical celebration of their own existence. The air was thick with the sound of laughter that teetered on the edge of madness, a cacophony of voices shouting over one another to drown out the gnawing whisper of conscience that still lingered in the back of their minds. They engaged in a collective delusion, a mass psychosis where adultery was rechristened as love and drunkenness as spiritual ecstasy, believing they had cheated the divine order. To them, the towering clay walls that encircled their sanctuary were not prison bars, but the hull of a great ark, destined to float above the coming flood of the faithful marching from Medina under the black banners of the Caliphate. They looked upon the world outside with pity and scorn, convinced that they alone possessed the secret key to a life without consequence, safe in the embrace of their charismatic protector who sat upon his throne of cushions, smiling at the chaos he had unleashed. However, beneath the veneer of this manufactured paradise, a slow and repulsive rot had begun to set in, a physical manifestation of the spiritual decay that festered in their hearts. The intricate irrigation channels, once crystal clear and singing with the sound of fresh currents, began to stagnate, choked by the debris of excess and the filth of overcrowding. The water took on a sickly, greenish hue and began to emit a faint, underlying stench of sewage and decomposition that no amount of jasmine or rosewater could fully mask. The sweet, heavy perfume of the flowers, which had initially been so enchanting, now mingled with the sour reek of unwashed bodies and fermenting refuse, creating a cloying, suffocating miasma that clung to the skin and filled the lungs. Yet, in their drunken stupor, the inhabitants of the garden refused to acknowledge the stench, breathing it in deep as if it were the breath of angels, blind to the fact that their oasis was slowly transforming into a cesspit, and that the flies buzzing around the heaps of discarded food were the first heralds of the devastation to come. The illusion of invincibility, constructed with such meticulous care by the liar and fed to his followers like sweet opium, evaporated in the span of a single afternoon when the horizon of the Nejdi ceased to shimmer with heat and instead grew dark with the shadow of judgment. The dust cloud that rose from the north was not a sandstorm born of the wind, it was the geological footprint of the army of the Caliphate, a disciplined machine of war led by the man known as the Sword of Allah, Khalid ibn al-Walid. The battle that ensued upon the open plains was short, brutal, and utterly devoid of the romance that Musaylima had promised his people. His army, 40,000 strong, surged forward with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of zealots, their minds clouded by wine and false prophecies, believing that their sheer numbers would overwhelm the forces of truth. But they crashed against the lines of the Muslim veterans like water breaking against a cliff face. The believers stood immovable, their discipline forged in the fires of Badr and Uhud, and they dismantled the disorganized rabble with a terrifying, mechanical efficiency. Panic, cold and primal, swept through the ranks of the Yamama tribesmen as they watched their brothers fall by the thousands, their heads severed with clean, professional strokes that spoke of years of martial experience. The fervor of the morning dissolved into the terror of the afternoon, and the formation of the false prophet shattered like cheap glass dropped on stone. It began as a waver, then a retreat, and finally, a chaotic, humiliating stampede as 40,000 men turned their backs to the enemy and fled toward the only sanctuary they knew, their high, whitewashed walls of the garden that loomed in the distance. They trampled their own kin in the mad dash for safety, casting aside swords and shields, driven by the singular, reptilian instinct to put a barrier between themselves and the relentless advance of Khalid's cavalry. The desert floor was left littered with the dead and the dying, a carpet of carnage leading directly to the gates of their false paradise. When the last of the survivors squeezed through the narrow entrance and the heavy, iron-bound timber gates were slammed shut and barred with trembling hands, a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the enclosure. The roar of battle was replaced by the sound of 40,000 chests heaving in unison, the air thick with the copper scent of blood and the sour reek of adrenaline-fueled sweat. For a moment, they felt a surge of relief, believing that the thick clay walls would protect them as they always had, that the garden was an impenetrable fortress where the laws of the outside world could not reach. But as the rhythmic thud of battering rams began to echo against the wood from the outside, the atmosphere within the oasis shifted from sanctuary to prison. Their high walls that had once kept the harsh desert out now kept the doomed in, turning the lush grove into a claustrophobic pen. In the deepening shadows of the date palms, eyes turned toward Musaylima, seeking reassurance, seeking a miracle, but the charisma that had once blinded them had vanished. The liar sat huddled in a far corner of the garden, his face the color of wet ash, his lips moving in silent, terrified spasms, and in his trembling form, his followers saw the first terrifying crack in their reality. Their shepherd had not led them to a fortress, but to a slaughterhouse, and he had just locked the door from the inside. The siege of the Garden of the Merciful was not destined to be a protracted war of attrition, for the resolve of the besiegers was harder than the granite of the surrounding hills, and their patience for the blasphemy hidden behind the walls had long since evaporated into the heat of the desert afternoon. The stalemate was broken not by siege engines or starvation, but by an act of suicidal bravery that defied all military logic, a moment that would be sung about in the campfire tales of the Bedouin for centuries to come. Bara ibn Malik, a warrior whose body was a map of scars from previous battles, demanded that his comrades lift him upon a shield and hurl him over the high fortification like a human projectile, a living stone cast directly into the heart of the enemy swarm. He flew through the air, a lone figure silhouetted against the blinding sun, and descended into the mass of 40,000 panicked heretics, not to die, but to open the way. He landed amidst the enemy with the fury of a trapped leopard, cutting a bloody swath toward the gate mechanism, ignoring the dozens of wounds that opened upon his flesh, driven by a singular, divine purpose to unlock the pen. When the heavy timber beams were finally lifted and the gates groaned open, they did not welcome a breeze of hope, but a tidal wave of steel and retribution. The army of the Caliphate poured into the enclosure like floodwaters breaching a dam, carrying the weight of inevitable judgment. The sanctuary instantly transformed into a suffocating kill box, a claustrophobic nightmare where the very density of the trees and the sheer number of bodies worked against the defenders. The garden, designed for leisurely strolls and drunken revelry, became a tactical hellscape where there was no room to maneuver, no space to swing a sword without striking a palm trunk or a fellow soldier. The tactics of the open field were abandoned for the brutal intimacy of close-quarters butchery, where men looked into the eyes of those they killed and felt the hot spray of arterial blood on their faces. The followers of Musaylima, trapped like rats in a burning granary, fought with the frantic, cornered viciousness of animals that know there is no escape, but their resistance only served to accelerate the grinding rhythm of the slaughter. The beautiful, meticulously engineered irrigation channels, which Musaylima had promised would flow with the water of paradise forever, began to run with a fluid that was thicker, darker, and far more precious than water. The pristine streams turned into sluggish arteries of crimson, carrying the lifeblood of thousands away from the carnage, until the volume became too great for the drains to handle and the liquid began to pool around the roots of the date palms. The thirsty earth, which had been artificially sustained for so long, quickly reached its saturation point and refused to drink any more, turning the carefully manicured soil into a treacherous, slipping quagmire of red mud and gore. Warriors slipped and fell in the slick mess, drowning in the blood of their enemies or being trampled into the paste of flesh and earth by the stampede of combat boots. The air, once perfumed with the delicate scent of jasmine and ripening dates, was now heavy with the metallic tang of iron and the bowel-loosening stench of sudden, violent death, a miasma so thick it could be tasted on the tongue. The paradise of the liar had been stripped of its mask, revealing its true nature. It was a bowl receiving a sacrifice of biblical proportions, a garden where the only crop being harvested was human life. The sun, now standing at its absolute zenith, cast no shadows to hide the carnage, illuminating a tableau worthy of a madman's brush, a paradise garden that had, in the span of a morning, transformed into an industrial-scale abattoir where the air was so thick with the iron scent of spilled life that it tasted like rusted coins on the tongue. The screams of the dying merged with the wet, sickening crunch of bone and the clash of steel to create a symphony of horror so loud and unnatural that even the carrion birds circling above faltered in their flight and fell from the sky, stunned by the sheer magnitude of the violence below. Amidst this swirling chaos, Musaylima, the self-proclaimed prophet who had promised his followers immunity from the grave, scrambled through the muck of his own making, his silk robes stained heavy and dark with the blood of the men he had deceived. He darted between the trunks of the date palms like a cornered rat, his eyes wide not with divine revelation, but with the terrified realization that his magic tricks could not stop a blade, and that the wall he had built to keep the world out had only succeeded in trapping death inside with him. He sought a path to safety, a hidden gate or a loyal guard, but found instead the cold, patient gaze of Washer ibn Harb, the Ethiopian spearman whose name was whispered in fear across the peninsula. This was the same warrior who, years prior in the days of his ignorance, had cast the javelin that killed Hamza, the Lion of God, and now he sought to wash that stain from his soul with the blood of the greatest liar in Arabia. Washer moved with the stillness of a predator amidst the frenzy of the brawl, his arm drawing back with a practiced, lethal grace that transcended the chaos around him. The javelin left his hand with the force of a thunderbolt, singing through the stifling air, threading the needle between the frantic combatants to find its mark in the soft flesh of the impostor. Musaylima did not ascend to the heavens in a pillar of light as he had claimed he would. He crumpled under the impact of the steel, his body folding in on itself with a pathetic, human fragility that betrayed every word he had ever spoken. He collapsed face first into the sludge of the garden floor, a grotesque mixture of mud, wine, crushed rose petals, and the gore of his disciples, gasping for air that would no longer fill his lungs. Around him, the battle raged on for a few heartbeat-defying seconds, but as the sight of their fallen leader rippled through the ranks of the defenders, a sudden, paralyzing shockwave halted their arms. The fanatics, who had fought with the desperation of men defending a god, watched in stupefied silence as the man who claimed to hold the keys to the universe twitched and grew still in the dirt. They waited for the resurrection, for the blinding light, for the earth to swallow their enemies, but the corpse remained stubbornly lifeless, just another piece of meat in a garden filled with butcher's waste. In that freezing moment of clarity, the spell that had held 40,000 minds in thrall was shattered not by a counter-argument, but by the undeniable, brutal reality of a dead body that bled just like their own. They stared at the empty shell of their idol, and the veil was violently ripped from their eyes, revealing not a sacred oasis, but a blood-soaked pen where they had been herded by a Narcissus to die for a vanity that was never divine. When the sun finally sank beneath the jagged rim of the desert, casting long, bruising shadows of purple and black across the devastation, a silence descended upon the garden of death that was heavier and more oppressive than any granite tombstone. The victors, their armor caked in a drying paste of gore and dust, wandered like ghosts through the labyrinth of carnage, stepping over mounds of twisted limbs and shattered torsos, struggling to comprehend the sheer, industrial scale of the massacre. Arabia had known war since the first camel was tamed, but it had never witnessed an acropolis like these mass graves situated within the grotesque luxury of a pleasure garden, where severed heads floated in decorative fountains and the blood of thousands had turned the carefully raked white sand into a sticky, black sludge. The walls that were meant to protect the chosen people now served only to contain the stench, concentrating the odor of death into a physical presence that pushed against the lungs and watered the eyes. It was no longer a sanctuary, it was a bowl of soup made of human remains, cooling in the twilight air. Among the heaps of the fallen, beneath the fractured trunk of a date palm that had been snapped in half by the surge of bodies, lay one of Musailamer's fervent disciples, his life ebbing away into the mud through a gash in his side. In his final, lucid moments, stripped of the hysteria of battle and the intoxication of wine, he turned his head to look at the corpse of his idol lying mere feet away. The liar's eyes were open, glazed over with the dull sheen of a dead fish, staring vacantly at the canopy of leaves he had claimed to command. The dying man waited for a breath, a twitch, a sign that this was merely another test of faith, but the flies that were already settling on the prophet's lips told a different story. A cold, crushing realization washed over the soldier, sharper than the pain of his wound. The prophecy had not been a total lie, but a cruel, monkey's paw twist of fate. Musailamah had promised that they would never leave this garden, that they would dwell here in eternal bliss, and he was right. They would never leave. They were to become part of the architecture, their bones serving as the foundation for the walls, their flesh decomposing to feed the roots of the very trees that shaded them. The horror of the Garden of Death did not end with the burial of the dead, it seeped into the very biology of the oasis. In the years that followed, local legends whispered that the date palms within the enclosure, fed by the nutrient-rich slurry of 40,000 decomposing fanatics, grew with a monstrous vitality that was unnatural to behold. The fruit they bore was said to be shockingly large and possessed a terrifyingly deep crimson hue, and when broken open, the flesh of the dates was not the color of amber, but the color of raw meat, oozing a juice that was sickeningly sweet. The garden did not become a stairway to heaven, it became an insatiable botanical stomach that had digested an entire tribe, a place where the boundary between the plant kingdom and the human soul had been blurred by blood. The blind faith of the people of Yamama had not elevated them to the divine, it had merely transformed them into high-grade fertilizer for a patch of accursed earth, leaving behind a legacy not of salvation, but of a silence so profound that travelers would deity for miles just to avoid hearing the wind rustle through the leaves of the trees that ate an army.